With RFK Jr. out of the presidential race and both parties having held their presidential conventions, in today's video we will be taking a look at the polling data in all 50 states to figure out who is the likely winner of the 2024 presidential election. First off, we're going to take a look at the national polling. As you can see right now, Kamala Harris holds a 1.5% lead over Donald Trump in current polling. As you can see, Kamala Harris is projected to win 48.4% of the vote, while former President Donald Trump is projected to win 46.9%. However, it is also important to look at the historical context. On the same day in the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden held a far more significant advantage, 7.1%, to Hillary Clinton back in 2016, who infamously lost that election to Donald Trump. At this point in time, she actually held a 6.3% advantage over Donald Trump in nationwide polling and ended up losing. Nevertheless, in today's video, we will be taking a look at the presidential election map if the polling was actually accurate. Now, of course, there's no real purpose in looking at every state, especially considering that most of these states are not really competitive. So instead, we're going to look at this map with the safe states vote in. I will fill in this map geographically, so starting off here with the state of Nevada, we're going to move our way to New England. First, in Nevada right now, Donald Trump holds a 1.4% lead over Kamala Harris, according to RCP's polling aggregate. Trump is at 47.4% to Kamala Harris at 46%. This is significant because this was a state that voted for Joe Biden back in the 2020 election. You can see that he won by a margin of roughly 2.4%. Now, if you look at the state of Nevada, you see a sea of red, which may indicate the fact that this is a red state. However, the two blue counties, which narrowly voted for Joe Biden each by single digits, Clark County and Washoe County, make up more than 90% of the state's population, which justifies how Joe Biden was ultimately able to win the state of Nevada. This time round, though, it looks like the rural areas may be able to overpower Las Vegas as well as Washoe County. So the state of Nevada here will be tilt Republican, which is again very significant because of the fact that not only did Joe Biden win the state, but Hillary Clinton also won the state back in 2016, despite losing the election. So not a good sign here for Kamala Harris when we start off today's video. The next state on this list will be the state of Arizona. Arizona voted for Joe Biden back in 2020. He turned out to be the first Democrat to be able to win the state in 24 years. The last time a Democrat was able to win was actually in the 20th century with Bill Clinton. Now, this was an exceptionally close margin, just 0.3% separated Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the state of Arizona. Currently in Arizona, although the polling has been quite divergent in terms of the fact that Kamala Harris leads in 3 polls while Donald Trump leads in 4, when you look at the spread right now, Donald Trump maintains a 0.2% advantage over Kamala Harris, which is just sufficient right now for a tilt margin in favor of Donald Trump. While this may seem like a slim margin, it is still very significant because again, this is a flip from 2020. As you can see, Donald Trump has already flipped 2 states, Nevada and Arizona, from the Kamala Harris column. Both states are pretty important for Kamala Harris, especially the state of Arizona. Next up, we will be moving to 2 deep blue states, the states of Colorado and New Mexico. Now, both of these states voted for Joe Biden back in 2020 by double-digit margins, Colorado by 13.5% and New Mexico by 10.8%. That being said, both these states are slightly more competitive in 2024, at least according to polling data. In the state of Colorado, where we do not have head-to-head polls between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, again, we have to cite some type of polling. It will be between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Biden held a 6.5% lead over Donald Trump, which may seem pretty good, but considering the fact that Biden won the state by more than double that margin back in 2020, could be a concerning sign for Kamala Harris. Now again, this is not apples to apples, but this is just a pretty narrow likely margin, not the best sign for Harris if this was actually her margin on election night. Now going to the state of New Mexico. New Mexico right now does have Kamala Harris up by 10%, which is similar to the margin that Joe Biden won the state by, but just a little bit under that. So right now New Mexico, though, still in this likely Democratic column. Now going to the state of Texas. Democrats in 2020 had a pretty wild dream. They were going to win the state of Texas, in their opinion, and polling data had suggested that this race was neck and neck for most of the campaign season before Trump pulled up a narrow lead in the final days of polling. Nevertheless, here the state was still neck and neck. Turned out the state was not really that competitive, with Donald Trump up against Joe Biden in the state by 5.8% when all was said and done. This was only a slightly narrower margin compared to 2016, where Donald Trump won the state by 9% over Hillary Clinton. Now, if you look at 2020 here, you also saw pretty significant gains for the Republican Party in the Rio Grande Valley. This is this part of the state, which is predominantly more Hispanic. Right now speaking, it's kind of painful for Democrats, but in the two most recent polls conducted, Trump leads by 7 points and 13 points respectively. Trump is probably in a pretty safe position to win the state of Texas, just because of the fact that the state was much more competitive in polling back in 2020 and wasn't actually close when all was said and done. The state of Texas now in the likely Republican column. Now going to the state of Florida. Florida is a state that Democrats consistently held a lead in back in polling back in 2016 and 2020. Back in 2016, Hillary Clinton had extremely high hopes and confidence that she was going to win. In 2020, Democrats also had very high hopes that they were going to win the state of Florida from the Republican column. Both of those dreams ultimately was not matched with the actual outcomes, especially in 2020. Biden consistently held between a 3 to 8% lead on 538 on the polling aggregate there between Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the state of Florida before Joe Biden shockingly lost the state by 3.3% against Donald Trump. This was in part because of his lackluster performance in Miami-Dade County, the largest county in the state. The state of Florida this time round is simply not competitive in polling, with Donald Trump up by 6.3% in terms of the aggregate, and Kamala Harris not being really within the margin of error in any of these polls. So the state of Florida right now in a likely Republican characterization, which does boost Donald Trump up to 212 electoral college votes. Now he is formally ahead of Kamala Harris. Next up, going to the state of Georgia. Georgia is a state that voted for Joe Biden in 2020 by just a margin of 0.23%. This was arguably the most unexpected flip out of any of the states in favor of the Joe Biden column back in 2020. Biden did pretty well in some of the suburbs around Atlanta and did not do that poorly in some of the rural areas, contrary to what some people may have expected. Nevertheless, here this time round, this state is probably the easiest flip opportunity for Donald Trump. Currently, he is up in the polling against Kamala Harris here by roughly 1%. It is noticeable that the state's polling has been quite accurate throughout history. However, some points in time the polling was not accurate. For example, back in 2016, Hillary Clinton was actually up in the state before she lost the state by 5% in the general election. However, polling by the general election had shown Trump up by about 4 to 5%, so you can't really argue the polls were significantly off. Now, nevertheless, here the state of Georgia in the tilt Republican column. Now going to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina right now seems to be in contention between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. However, there's something pretty deceiving about these polls. Firstly, back in 2020, this was a state that voted for Donald Trump. And really, it's not that in play, although many Democrats believe it is, simply because of the fact that, again, someone like Kamala Harris probably won't do as well in some of the suburban areas because she does not have that white working class appeal and that kind of white college-educated appeal that Joe Biden may have had back in 2020. Nevertheless, here in the state of North Carolina, there might be another factor that may be skewing some of the polls, is the governor's race here. Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate, has been significantly underpolling Josh Stein, the Democrat, who has been leading by between 5 and 14 points in some of these polls. When you discount that, when you consider that race, it makes sense why Donald Trump is only leading by such a slim margin. I personally think that Trump will win the state by 5%, but I'm going to abide by polling for now and give the state of North Carolina to Donald Trump by just a tilt margin. Now going to Iowa and Ohio, where we don't have to talk about a lot of things. First off, back in 2020, both of these states voted for Donald Trump by 8% over Joe Biden, despite the fact that some Democrats, especially some of those high-ranking officials, believed the fact that Democrats had a shot to win both of these states. That did not happen. Part of their belief originated from the 2012 election, where Barack Obama was able to defeat Mitt Romney in both those states, especially in Iowa by a pretty substantial margin, by more than 5%, and Ohio by roughly 2%. You look at how some of these counties ended up voting up. For example, Mahoning County, this was a county that voted for Obama by 28. This was not even a county that Joe Biden was able to carry back in 2020. So therefore, you can clearly establish the fact, combined with some of the polls here, that the state of Ohio is just not competitive between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Ohio goes likely Republican. The same can be said for the state of Iowa. Again, I showed you that significant shift between 2012 and 2020. Right now, although we don't have apples to apples comparisons, Donald Trump is up against Joe Biden in the state by 11.5. Now, of course, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are two different people. Nevertheless, you kind of get the picture. It's going to be really hard for Democrats to even make the state remotely competitive. As a result, right now, the state will be in the likely Republican column, abiding by the polling data I just showed you. Before we head on to the more contentious states in the Midwest, I'm going to briefly fill in Nebraska's 2nd District, which has no polls. Now, I'm just going to fill it in based on my opinion. Back in 2020, the state voted for Joe Biden by around 7%. This is largely an Omaha-based district that has been heavily trending toward the Democratic Party. As a result, I'm going to have to put this district in the lean blue column for safety measures. Although I do not believe that Kamala Harris will do as well as Joe Biden did in the suburbs, it's still going to be leaning blue on this map. Now going to the state of Virginia. Virginia is currently a state that has Kamala Harris up by 4%. Now you might look at this and say that's a pretty good piece of news for the Democratic Party. However, that's not necessarily the case. In 2020, Joe Biden was able to defeat Donald Trump in Virginia by more than 10 percentage points. In other words, by a double-digit margin. Now, if you look at the shift from 2016, you can see that Democrats significantly overperformed in some of the suburban areas like Virginia Beach County, Chesterfield County, as well as Loudoun County. A 6% shift towards the Republican Party, like some polls may indicate, would be disastrous for Democrats and have major implications elsewhere. For instance, if Democrats are underperforming in Virginia, that could spell trouble for Democrats nationwide in suburban areas, including areas like Georgia, around the Fulton area, or areas in the Rust Belt like Oakland County in the state of Michigan. Nevertheless, here the state of Virginia still in the lean blue column, though that could still be a big problem here for Kamala Harris if that type of margin actually translates on election day. Now going to Maine's 2nd Congressional District, this small district over here. Of course, right now, we don't have a lot of polls here between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, so we're going to use a not-so-apples-to-apples comparison by looking at Trump versus Biden in this district, where Trump had an average lead of about 17%. Do keep in mind that this district is notoriously difficult to poll, but still, I'm going to have Maine 2nd right now in the safe red column. Now, Maine's at-large vote right now, according to Trump versus Harris polling, is suggesting the fact that Kamala Harris is up by about 13%. Now, this is a rather large characterization because Biden only won the state by 8 and Hillary Clinton won the state by 3. I believe this will be closer to the actual election results in Maine's at-large vote, but I'm going to abide by the polls for now and say this is a safe blue state. Now finally going to the state of New Hampshire, a state that lives by its live free or die symbol. The state of New Hampshire voted for Joe Biden by 7 over Donald Trump back in 2020. It is very white college educated and a state that is definitely very fluid in its politics. Right now, if you look at New Hampshire here, about a 5% lead for Kamala Harris. That would be a lean characterization in our current map, putting here Kamala Harris up at 216 to Donald Trump at 268. Of course, the election will come down to the 4 Rust Belt states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Specifically, the Rust Belt 3, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. First off, I'm going to start off with the least competitive of these 4 states, the state of Minnesota. Governor Tim Walz is of course from the state of Minnesota, and he is Kamala Harris's running mate, boosting Democratic chances in the state, which was already pretty high considering the fact that Kamala Harris is currently polling about 8% in front of Donald Trump in the state of Minnesota. Now, I do not expect that to be the final margin. I expect it to be closer to 4 to 5 points, especially because the Rust Belt has historically overestimated Democrats, at least on a presidential election level. Right now, Kamala Harris, though, does get the benefit without a doubt and gets a likely characterization from the state of Minnesota. Now going to the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin polling has been historically an absolute shipwreck. Currently speaking, Kamala Harris is up by 1%. However, do remind yourself that the polling here is definitely not the most reliable indicator. Back in 2016, Hillary Clinton was leading in the state at this point in time by double digits, 11.5%. If you look at the fact that she actually lost the state by 0.7%, that is about a 12% margin of error in polling. In the modern day era, that is simply unacceptable. Even in 2020, where the polling error was more modest as compared to now, that would still yield about a R plus 2.5 result in the final margin. So that is definitely something to be considerate at this moment in time. Not to mention the fact that Joe Biden only won the state by 0.63% by getting pretty much everything to go right for him. The economy at the time wasn't doing the best. Coronavirus simply considerably hampered Donald Trump's chances of actually winning re-election. And even then, Joe Biden actually only won the state by 0.63%, defying many Democrats and Republicans' expectations. Right now, though, the state of Wisconsin, I'll have to agree with the polling right now, not because I actually agree with it, but just because this is a polling-based map. The state of Wisconsin does go in the tilt blue column. Now going to the state of Michigan. Michigan right now does have Kamala Harris up by 2%, which is still smaller than Joe Biden's 2.8% lead in the state when all the ballots were counted. Now, if you look at the state of Michigan, again, the polls here have not been historically the most accurate. Hillary Clinton was overestimated in the state by more than 9% back in 2016. She was heavily anticipated to win the state. She had like a 90% chance to win it on FiveThirtyEight, and she still ended up losing the state by just about 10,000 votes. Now, of course, that is a small margin. However, again, these polls are just not very accurate of an indicator. Additionally, there's one poll that suggests Harris is up by 11. That's probably really skewing the average in general, and when you factor that out, Harris's lead goes down to below a 1 percentage point. Now, with all things being considered, the state is still going to be tilting blue just because of the purposes of this video, the fact that this is not my prediction and simply a video based on polling data. Now, with everything in mind, the election comes down to the state of Pennsylvania once again, just like it did back in 2020. Drumroll please. And with that, the state does go to Donald Trump by a margin of 0.2% when all the polls are considered. Trump is leading in 6 polls, Kamala Harris is leading in 3, and 1 poll has the election as a tie. Now, part of that is probably because that Donald Trump was nearly assassinated in the state of Pennsylvania, specifically Butler County. Now, this state will definitely probably be the tipping point state in 2024, making it even more significant. Now, if you look at the polling right now, you might say that this is very close. However, again, you have to consider polling error. Back in 2020, Joe Biden had a 5.8% lead in the state of Pennsylvania at this moment in time on Real Clear Politics. Clinton, meanwhile, held a 9.2% lead just to lose the state to Donald Trump. Now, if you look at the polling error, when you consider that, then Trump's lead is significantly greater. However, because this is just a simple polling video, the state is only tilting in the Republican column, giving Trump just enough to win the presidency, 287. Now, if Kamala Harris actually won the state, that would have given her 270, but of course, Donald Trump will end up winning the state of Pennsylvania. So what's a summary for this video? Now, according to polling, Donald Trump is ever so slightly favored to win the election. He wins 5 states by tilt margins or less than 2%, while Kamala Harris wins 2 states, Wisconsin and Michigan, by less than a 2% margin or a tilt characterization. According to polling at least, this election is very competitive. However, what do you get when you actually adjust on the polls based on past error? You can click on this video right here to find out, or subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want more unbiased election coverage. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.